Copyright 2009, University of Auckland, all rights reserved.
Okay, we're going to go into question time now. We've gone way over our 5 minutes, but so we're going to have hopefully alternating questions, and each the side that's having the question asked to them will have 2 to 3 minutes to answer, and the opposing team will have about 1 or 2 minutes to respond to that answer. So if you could please keep your questions brief and to the point, and yeah, we'll try to get an equal number of questions for each team going. So to get the ball rolling, I'll ask the first question, and my question is to the atheist side. One of your the theist side's debaters brought up a really good point about historical claims, that they can't possibly meet the same testability, repeatability tests that we can apply to other sorts of claims. And I was just wondering if somebody from your side wanted to address that point.
Well, no, that is a good point. And I do agree that the standards for, or the methods for assessing historical evidence are different from assessing claims in the present day, sure. I mean, I don't deny the historicity of Jesus Christ as put through, definitely not. Though I would ask for greater than anecdotal evidence for proving his divinity. I would ask for greater than an appeal to a false dichotomy. Are they crazy or are they telling the truth? One or the other, for assessing, I mean, especially a claim like that. That's my response.
I think the other thing is you can also have repeatability, because the example he uses when Poland was invaded, but we've got multiple sources from that. That's repeatability. So you've got German's own history, you've got the English history, you've got the Russian history. The Polish people certainly remember it because they actually is built into their flag. But when we look at the claims of historicity of Jesus, it predominantly comes from the Bible. There are no really contemporary sources, and quite a few of those sources contradict each other in terms of what his final words were. Did the crucifixion happen before or after Passover? This is not something you'd mix up or confuse. And some pretty amazing things, like there was a huge darkness over the land and the earthquake, and a whole lot of zombies jumped out of the tombs and went and visited other people, yet the Romans did not write this down. So when we're talking about repeatability, we're not just saying that you can put it under an experiment and show it here and now. We're also talking about, do you have multiple independent sources that have no reason to change things, or is it just the one source? And I think with Christianity, it's just the biblical writings, the Gospels, that establish that claim, nothing else.
Yeah, so effectively we sit in a very similar position as far as what historical evidence should look like, I think. We're looking for accumulation of sources, we're looking for the best explanation, and I think that that's the only way we can do history. I think it's difficult to make negative claims about history for the obvious reason that we don't have all the sources now, 2,000 years on, we don't have access to all of that. But what I would say is that what we don't have is one single monolithic source. We have references to Jesus across a number of different sources, and even within the Bible, we're talking about 4 books written by 4 different people who don't so much disagree on different points as view it from different perspectives. We're not talking about clearly conflicting claims, we're talking about people who told the same story in different ways, but all brought out different aspects of the same truth. And I think that's the position that we would take on it, is that there isn't these 4 conflicting versions that can't be meshed, nor is there one uniform version that we should dismiss as a single source. What there is there's 4 different sources that have a harmony, a way they fit together and come out as a single story that makes a lot of sense, and that's where I would come down.
Thank you. So, questions from the audience?
This is a question for the theists. I just asked Timothy this during the break, but I thought some other people might be interested in the answer. This is for anybody, though. So, hypothetically, let's say a man is wholly good. He's generous in every aspect of his life. He gives in every way. He is good by all the moral standards of the Bible, except he says Allah instead of God. Does he go to heaven or does he go to hell?
I can't speak for all Christians, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everyone to respond to that question for themselves with a yes or a no, because that's the only fair way to do it. For myself, the answer to that question is yes, that person would go to hell, and I'll come back in a second as to why that is, but first, show of hands, who would agree with me? Yeah, so, well, yeah, we've got hands in the audience as well. It sounds like the microphone's working now. So where I would come down on this issue, and that's me, what I was saying about this before was simply that Christianity...
Sorry, your mic's off now.
Christianity makes the claim that Jesus is actually necessary, that you can't be saved without Jesus because there is no one who is good. And that's one of the fundamental claims that Christianity makes, that no one is good and so we need a savior. To say that sending one savior is not enough is to either say that you don't think that we need a savior, and that's one view you can take, or to say that sending one wasn't enough and that God should just keep doing it until he's got as many as he needs. Given what the one savior had to do to become the savior of mankind, I think that sending more people to do it would be a little bit unfair. In the same way, if we don't need one, then sending one in the first place was a really bad idea. Does anyone else want to add to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think, first and foremost, I think it's unfair to say that Christianity is the only religious belief system that makes exclusive claims here. If Muhammad spoke the truth, then I'll go to hell. If the avatars of Hinduism spoke the truth, then I'm in for a very difficult and painful reincarnation. And if the atheist spoke the truth, well, God does not exist, and when we all die, we rot and become recycled fertilizer. So Christianity is not the only belief system that makes exclusive claims here. Now, the logic of the New Testament is clear here. The Bible says that all have sinned and fallen short of God's moral standard. Romans chapter 3, verse 2-3. And because we've all sinned, because we've all broken God's moral law, we're all culpable for divine judgment. Because God is just, he must punish sin and evil. But God is also merciful, and God's mercy is demonstrated by becoming a man in the person of Jesus, who essentially stands in the dock on our behalf and says to the judge, I will bear the weight and the penalty that that person deserves for their sin. Let them go. So Jesus absorbs the punishment and penalty that we deserve for our sin, thus providing the means for forgiveness. Now, when somebody rejects Jesus, they are essentially rejecting God's offer of forgiveness through the offer of forgiveness through God has made for them through his son's death on the cross. So if somebody rejects that offer of forgiveness, God is not going to coerce you, he's not going to manipulate you to spend eternity with him. If you reject that offer of forgiveness, then God will honor your request in the next life and you'll spend eternity separate from him. That will be hell. So in essence, God doesn't send anybody to hell. Really, people send themselves to hell. As one theologian said, hell is God's great compliment to human freedom as it preserves the dignity of human choice. So.
But how does a person who's never been introduced to Christianity in the middle of the Amazon for the past 1,000 years plus know about Christianity and Jesus? So he deserves hell because he's never ventured outside of the rainforest?
That's all. Do you want to?
Sure.
Hold on, we'll just get a response here from... do you guys want to push the button, or...?
I think you bring up a really good point to say that someone is going to go to hell. What is hell, by the way? To think that because someone believes in Allah and so they're going to... Because I want to know what separation from God means, because we often hear about hellfire and eternal torture. I think it's a rather wicked thing to say, actually. So what, I'd ask the other team, what does hell mean?
Well, I've good news and bad news. The good news is I'm pretty sure that the images of fire and so forth that the Bible uses are metaphorical. The bad news is that I'm pretty sure hell is worse. We might want to say that hell is eternal separation from God, and that's really bad. It might be, you might characterize hell as the disintegration of one's being to be in a state of death. That's a terrible thing, and that's what would happen if you die without responding positively to the message of the gospel or to Christ. The answer to your question regarding Islam would be yes. I'd want to nuance that, because I think it's possible for Christ to reveal himself in a culture which is imbued very much with the Islamic tradition. The answer to your other question was how can it be fair of God or how can it be just of God to sentence someone to hell for not believing something that they never had an opportunity to respond to? Christian theology is pretty clear on this. You're not sentenced to hell on the basis of what you don't know. You're sentenced, well, first of all, you're not really sentenced. You're inevitably going there, and God's action is to rescue and come in and stop where you're inevitably going to end up. Secondly, God has revealed himself in general revelation. And so if you respond to the lights that you've been given in general revelation, that some sort of deity exists, you might not know his name, you've responded well to the moral law that's placed upon your heart, then those people, though they may have never heard of Christ, still would be recipients of salvation and not need to go to hell. Now, it all depends on your response to what you have been given.
Just add a quick kind of maybe a meta point, just in that these kinds of things are actually quite complicated and they're quite detailed, and what the kind of response that this team gives might not strike you as plausible initially. I think the same is true of many complicated and detailed things. So if you don't happen to believe in, say, evolution, someone tries to explain it to you in a very short amount of time, the chances are that will end up looking implausible from the outside. But I guess I just suggest that we think we do have good reasons for thinking that the core claims of Christianity are true, and that when you actually look into it, they actually do seem plausible. So I just encourage you, don't just write it off because from the outset it doesn't look nice or it doesn't look plausible from, say, a naturalistic worldview. Also, a quick response, Blake suggested that hell would be wicked. This is interesting, given that they seem to have denied moral realism or objective morality. So I don't think he can actually say that, but we can talk about that later.
Okay, let's. Do you guys want to respond before we move on to the next question? Or?
I think we can still make a subjective judgment that hell is wicked. I don't think there needs to be an objective moral compass for us to be able to say that. Okay. If the idea of eternal punishment for a finite crime, if you don't like that, that's purely subjective judgment still.
I had one, for the atheistic side, and I hope I'm not nitpicking too much, but it was regarding creation of the universe, and you discussed quantum tunneling, one universe begetting another. I was wondering if you were implying by that universes are creating each other ad infinitum. One universe creates another by quantum tunneling and so on and so forth. Or if there's some alpha universe which was there first, and if so, are you not just distancing yourself from the burden of proof, saying we don't need to explain how the mechanism for a universe being created, it was just off-tunneled from another?
Well, no, I don't think it's shifting the burden of proof at all. Cosmologists are trying to come up with plausible models and test them. They're certainly not just sweeping things under the rug. My admittedly limited understanding of it, gleaned from expert cosmologists, is that mathematically, and it works out perfectly well just with undergrad physics, is that two different universes with different arrows of time can quantum tunnel through a potential barrier. And well, that's it, I suppose.
It sounds like you mean to say one universe is creating the other, which then going the other way in time creates the first universe again. No? Okay. So, I mean, I know we don't have time to go into too much detail.
It doesn't matter what you end up with. Even if I could come with a self-contained way of our universe being created, and it was an infinite regress, you're still stuck with the thing as why do we have something rather than nothing, which is essentially what the cosmology argument is about. The point we were trying to make with the cosmology side that was presented was that there is a lot of different competing ideas, and they've taken the one that they like and they've run with that one, ignoring some of the other implications that the people who study those models say, well, this is probably true based on that. And really, the most honest position to say is we don't know, and go from there.
Yes, do you want to respond to that specific point?
Sure. The argument that I presented was from the principle of sufficient reason, which says that everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. And this argument is independent of any physical description of what the universe may or may not be. It's, let's say the universe is eternal. Well, why does that exist rather than nothing? Let's say it has a beginning, which I think is the majority consensus view at the moment. Well, why does that exist rather than nothing? It would still be, the universe would still be a contingent being, something that requires an explanation that would be in an external cause. So my argument would still hold there.
Am I up? Okay. My question is for the theist side. Why did God instill in all of us the flaw of not being able to identify Christ in all situations and circumstances? For example, a friend of mine died a year ago on Monday, and she was Muslim. Why did he put her on the earth only to take her away in the way that he did, and then also to not give her the ability to find Christ?
So, I mean, fundamentally that comes back to a question that's already been discussed a little bit with the question of why are people born in situations where they're not in Christian families or whatever else. But the other half of that is to say, why isn't it the case that in us there is this automatic God switch that the moment we're exposed to some essence of revelation, we automatically understand everything about it, and we jump to the conclusion that, you know, we're meant to, that this is the right answer. Why doesn't that happen? The reason that Christianity puts forward for that is because at some point in history, mankind got broken. We started off with an ability to see truth and to understand truth, but somewhere along the line, something happened which Christianity says was sin, and the effect of that was that we no longer have that perfection. Instead, we've got an inherent part of ourselves that is broken in some way, and that contributes to the way we see the world, that contributes to the way that we act, and that fundamentally is the difference between us and God, is the broken part of us, the part that is no longer the way that it was. So effectively the answer is God didn't make us that way, we chose to make ourselves that way at some point. And there are different views on how that happened, and I think across this panel we'd actually have different views about that. But the fundamental thing that the Christian belief says about this is that at some point humans chose sin instead of God, and the result of that was that they got sin instead of God. And that's where it trims back to. The answer is that that's exactly what Jesus is here to do, is to wipe away the sin and to replace it with perfection. But we can only participate in that in the same way that happens throughout Scripture if we participate in the salvation that's offered.
Do you guys want to respond to that?
Okay. I would respond to that by saying he seems to make it easier for some of us to accept Jesus' salvation, though. And I think that's kind of what she's getting at. Why did her Muslim friend not have the same sort of faith that you guys do? For example, everyone on this panel has been a Christian in the past, and I know many who started out Christians and couldn't believe. Myself, I actually really tried. I tried, absolutely genuinely, and I just could not accept it. So I think it's more of a question of why do some people grow up in a Christian household and it is easy for them to accept it, and why, like with the example of the man in the rainforest, why does he not get the same fair shake?
Well, as a continuation for that, I have to ask, it seems like the choice has been made for me already. You say we made this choice, humankind, but I certainly did not. And you say that Jesus has come to save us from the fate we're preordained for by our own actions. But how is one to know, since we have a broken sensus divinitatis, as it were, how is one to know that Jesus is in fact the way, the truth, and the light, even as the Bible claims? The Jews, for example, don't accept. How do we verify that he is? Could he not be another being claiming to have salvation? Could he not be the devil, even, claiming to be salvation, but tricking us, since we are no longer able to know, since our ability is gone, as you say?
Can we respond to this?
Yeah, I'll let you guys respond to that, because there's some questions raised.
Yeah. Can you just reiterate your first point, Kieran?
Reiterate the first point.
Well,
but I didn't make the choice, don't you?
Oh, right, yeah, okay, sure. You didn't make the choice. I guess I'd argue that you, and each of us does participate in that choice over and over again. So kind of who made the first choice, I'm not sure that that's so important. What I see around me is that people continue to participate in that choice to reject God and choose self over God. Now, the second idea is we've got a broken sensus divinitatis, so we can't sense God, therefore we're not to blame for it. I don't think our sensus divinitatis is broken to that extent. So we can actually find God, or God can find us. And how do we know that it's not the devil doing these things? I guess we don't know with certainty, but it's a matter of inference, the best explanation. And this is a longer conversation, but I think we do have good reasons to trust that God is good rather than not good, and it's not an evil demon deceiving us. So I just think that the evidence stacks up in such a way that the correct inference to the best explanation is that God is actually the one behind the way that we see the universe is.
Do you guys want to respond to that just quickly, and then we'll try to go on to the next question?
No, next question.
Okay, yep.
I'm just wondering, what do you mean by nothing? Because it seems to me that the very idea of nothing itself may just be a completely incoherent idea.
Right, that's a good question because it's raised a lot of hoopla from Lawrence Krauss, who misdefines nothing. What I mean by nothing is what Leibniz means by nothing, and that is not anything. Not anything, and that's a supremely coherent definition.
I like to know, is nothing even possible? Like, we only know one way as supposedly think that nothing could exist. That's no matter, no energy, no time, nothing, no space, absolutely nothing. And that's an insane position. But so there's one way we know that could exist, and there's an infinite number of ways you can have something. So should we be surprised that we have something? And I do think this definition of nothing is something that's going to warp everyone's mind. So.
Okay, so I'm afraid another question for Theists, but when you were talking about the idea of a necessary being earlier, you were using the example of a triangle, so you can't have a square triangle or something. But in that sense, I guess for something to be necessary, you can't. The implication seems to be that you can't logically admit the possibility of it not existing, and that you can't even, for examples that you've given, you can't even form the idea of it not being the case, because the idea itself is incoherent. But we can form a logically consistent and plausible kind of explanation or idea of a universe without a God. And it, I guess in a certain logical sense, works. So in that sense, I don't see how God could be necessary.
Right, I didn't actually use that example of it, and you're right, I think a square triangle would be incoherent. So such a being would necessarily not exist. It would be incoherent, impossible for it to exist. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that a universe without God has a certain sense about it. One can imagine what the universe would be like if there was no God. But what I mean by God being a necessary being is that if he exists, he is the type of being which would be necessary, that cannot not exist. And so God would be, by definition, a necessary being if he exists.
Just note, we haven't actually defended the ontological argument. So we're not saying that because God is a necessary being, that means he does exist. Just if that God did exist, he would be the kind of thing that could not exist. So yeah, I'm not sure what else to say to your question. I'm not sure how it's a rebuttal.
Sorry, as someone who's never studied philosophy and so took a couple of years to understand what the point of this is, effectively what Stuart was trying to do when he was talking about necessary beings is say that there could be a God who is a necessary being and would not require an explanation for that reason, like he would be self-explaining. That's what the issue was about. We're not saying that God is a necessary being and therefore he exists. We're saying that we've gone another way to get to the conclusion that God exists. From that conclusion, we're saying he doesn't need any explanation because necessity is basically, I can explain myself. Oh, sorry, yeah.
So, yeah, you seem to think that the only kind of necessary beings that exist are things such as triangles or other kind of abstract Platonic objects. I think that's a big claim to make, and I think, the burden of proof may be on you to explain why that's the only kind of necessary being that exists. So we're arguing that there is a different, you're right, there's a different kind of necessary being, which is an immaterial mind. But I think given the nature of the universe that it is rational to make the inference to this immaterial mind. And if such an immaterial mind did exist, it is such that it could not exist, so it would be a necessary being.
Okay. Does anybody from your team want to respond to that?
It just seems very circular. If I make a statement that, I don't know, I have decided that a block of cheese, that if it did exist, it has a necessary component that it exists and cannot be logicked away. You're making a statement kind of out of the blue. It's very tautological.
Sounds like the conclusion's built into the premise from the get-go.
So what's the conclusion and what's the premise?
God exists.
And that's the premise. We haven't said that.
Okay, this would be a criticism of the ontological argument, which I didn't give today. And a block of cheese is not the type of thing that could be necessary. Obviously, it began to exist. It can fail to exist. There's nothing about a cheese that would suggest that it's maximally great like a being like God would be if he existed. So.
I could say the same thing about God.
Oh, no, a maximally great being is a being with maximally great qualities, such as all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving, and so forth. That's what a maximally great being is, and such a being would necessarily exist. That would be a great-making quality.
Okay, we'll go on to the next question. If we could have a question for the...
Yeah, so for the atheist side, right, I'd like to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. I was just wondering, we talk about Jesus being resurrected, his disciples seeing it, 500 people, and they say, okay, Jesus rose, so we're going to go and tell the world, and the people say, if you tell us again, we'll kill you, and they continue to do that. So, you might say, oh, they're crazy or whatever. How would you explain the spread of Christianity, the fact that someone comes to me and say, a poor Jewish carpenter, he rose from the dead, now believe in him and go tell everyone else, oh, by the way, they're going to kill you for doing that. I wouldn't take the bait, but how would you explain, because the Christians say, oh, that's true. What is your best explanation for the spread of Christianity throughout the world, throughout history?
Well, how would you explain the spread of Scientology? For a single science fiction author to write a treatise based on his popular novels and then turn it into a cargo cult of anti-psychiatry that is practiced by thousands, hundreds of thousands of people. I mean...
Or Islam, for that matter.
Well, yeah. It fills supposedly a spiritual gap for belief, right? And when you live in a perhaps barbaric regime, the Roman Empire, circa 0 AD, and someone comes along and tells you that you can be saved and have no such judgment upon yourself, as you've been previously told. If your quality of life is terrible and you're poorly educated, what more do you have to hold on to? It's a very nice thing to believe. That's my answer.
Just the fact there were many rich Christians who gave up their belongings, their status, whatever. But in terms of Scientology, Islam, there's that fundamental difference of religions where they have works, and so it appeals to the fundamental pride of humans, like, oh, I can work to be good enough. Whereas the Christian faith basically says, yeah, you're screwed. It's free, and of course everyone wants that, but you're screwed and you have to humble yourself, and it's a fundamental, just something that you don't want to hear. And so why would someone give up their all for that? Kind of like that. I don't know if it makes sense.
Okay, so when you've got to look at the various religions around the world, they've all got different qualities about them. Now, we've got Jesus Week this week, and Zach's put a lot of work into it, and I think he's done a fantastic job. You're getting free pizza, and I'm not too proud to eat it as well. And so when you're getting offered something, and you've got people actively going out and evangelizing for it, it's no surprising that people start believing it. Now, people also believe every year that you have sightings of UFOs coming down, and with multiple people saying, we saw the same thing, never saw each other. And do we supposed to believe that? People are inclined to believe stuff. It just happens. It's the way it is. You've got to establish that beyond out of the noise that we have from things like Scientology, which I think is ridiculous, through to UFO abductions, through to more, say, reasonable and understandable beliefs like Christianity. And there are faiths out there that don't actually have those sort of evangelizing things built into them, like the Mongols when they took over. You were still allowed to believe what you wanted to believe. Many other faiths say you can still believe, providing you give credit to their God. In the Mongols' case, why would you worship my God? He's my God, he's not yours. So that explains why you have these spreads.
I just want to make one other point. You said that the rich Christians gave away their belongings and that Christianity is different from the other ones, which you don't have to work for salvation. Well, doesn't that explain the spread itself in that case? Who doesn't want something for nothing if the alternatives are you must work hard?
Yeah, so Zach and I are both going to respond. I'll start by kind of covering the first couple of points that were raised. Effectively, what you've said is that the spread of Christianity can be explained in the same way that Scientology and Islam can be explained. And I'd say there are two fundamental differences that make Christianity a little bit more difficult to explain. The first one, particularly if we're contrasting Scientology, I'm not familiar with any Scientologists who've been killed for their beliefs. Maybe in the future that might be a thing. As of yet, hasn't happened. The early Christians were faced with a society that would kill them for believing what they believed, and so there was a higher cost associated with that. Now, I don't think that's an impossible threshold, because you can point to other faiths where that has been crossed. The difference, I'd say, is this. The people who were making the claims to begin with were the people who were bearing the brunt of that cost. Muhammad was not personally being killed for the fact that he was claiming he had visions. Peter and people like that were personally being killed for claiming that they personally had seen Jesus Christ. I think it's more difficult to explain why they wouldn't renege on that at some point than it is to explain why other people, so people beyond the ones who claim to have personally seen Jesus, would continue to believe it in the first century.
I think it's very easy to kind of give this abstract kind of explain away religion with a capital R. That whole supernatural stuff, we'll just explain that away with this kind of standard go-to explanation. But I don't think it works in the case of Christianity. I think you actually do have to take these worldviews on their own terms and actually look at them individually. And they are quite different. In the same way that I can't just dismiss all other worldviews, treating them all the same, or they're not Christian, therefore I should discount them. Non-naturalistic worldviews kind of have the same relationship. But in particular, I guess I'd suggest look at who were the early Christians who were converting. Were they kind of dumb peasants who kind of had something to gain out of it because then they got the idea of eternal life? I don't think so. They're actually quite well educated, a lot of them, and some of them quite wealthy. But also a lot of them were Orthodox Jews. So they already had a belief system. They already believed they were going to heaven. They already had a religion. They had a community. They had everything you could want from religion, per se. So it wasn't the introduction of religion into kind of a nihilistic background as maybe we see more today in our culture. It was a change of religion, a change which was considered blasphemous by the mainstream, and a change which I think requires an explanation. Why did these Orthodox Jews decide to change religion and decide to hold a view which got them in a lot of trouble and didn't give them much materially?
Okay, let's move on to the next question.
It's kind of like a joint question that we were kind of talking about. But so for the resurrection of Jesus, this for theists, say I heard that you said that there were like 500 people that said that they had seen Jesus after he had died and he'd been resurrected, and they all seen him at separate times and things, and they were willing to die for it. So could I then kind of make the claim that hypothetically speaking, I had 500 people that saw at separate times like Spider-Man's flinging around or something. I don't mean to disrespect or anything. It's just, but and then they were convicted and sentenced to murder. Would it be fair to say that because 500 people at separate times or whatever had made the claim that they'd seen Spider-Man, that it could then be true, and now that there's kind of evidence to support it?
Yep. Yeah, sure. I think we have to remember what the disciples died for. The disciples didn't die for a religious belief. They didn't die for a religious belief. They died for what they claimed to have seen. Now, the difference between Christianity and Islam is when Muslims lay their life down for the truth of Islam, they're not in a position to verify what did or did not happen concerning the life of Muhammad. But you see, the disciples were in a position of absolute verification. They knew exactly what did or did not happen concerning the resurrection. Now, if the disciples laid down their life, if the disciples were willing to die for what they claimed to have seen, they never would have died for what they knew to be a lie. Does that make sense? So people don't die to cover up what they know to be a lie. The disciples were in a position to know exactly what did or did not happen concerning the resurrection.
To answer the question, I think, a little more directly, if you can show me 500 people who are willing to die for claiming that they've seen Spider-Man, I will 100% believe in Spider-Man. Just personally, I think that would be really cool.
Are you going to believe them? Are you going to believe them? Because if you're going to say that 500 people can make the claim that they've seen someone come back from the dead, and it must be true, then it kind of leaves kind of like opportunity that, oh well, these other 500 people said that they've seen, I don't know, a UFO flying around in the sky, so therefore they must be true.
Yeah, sure.
We'll just let the atheist team respond first, and if you want to add anything.
I think you've pretty much hit the nail on the head. Just because someone says something to be true doesn't make it true. And sincerity of belief also doesn't make it true. You take a look at the Heaven's Gate cult. There's still some Heaven Gators around, but these people believe that they would actually transpose themselves into new bodies, and they all took their own life. You have many other faiths throughout time who have been persecuted, murdered for what their faith, for their beliefs, including those people who claim to have actually seen the thing. So there's nothing particularly special about it. You need to have, just saying that a particular faith spread quite quickly and people had conviction, that only shows that the faith spread quickly and they have conviction, not that the faith claims themselves are true. You probably say it's probably less likely that they were making it up and they were lying, but that doesn't mean that they weren't mistaken or fooled or tricked or delusional, insane, whatever you want to say. Similarly, same thing with aliens coming to Earth. I believe them. But
did you want to say one more thing?
Sure. So in the case of UFOs, I think there's a better explanation of most of those, of the general phenomena of UFOs. There's multiple different explanations, but so the problem is that there are better explanations. In the case of the resurrection, there is not, our claim is there is not a better explanation. And there's, oh sure, we can talk about this. I'd love to talk about it. Like, I've got shelf loads of books on this stuff. Do come and talk. So there is not a better explanation. Maybe if you start with naturalism and you assume naturalism the only possibility, then of course, yeah, you end up in a naturalistic answer, but the naturalistic one actually, taking a step back from that naturalistic worldview is not very plausible. So just a general point about probability is whenever you're assessing the probability of an event, you need to take into account the background or prior probability, as well as the probability which the evidence adds to that. And I think another feature which we haven't discussed, which I don't have time to go into, is that the prior probability of the resurrection is actually reasonably high, whereas the prior probability of, say, Elvis returning to life, or the prior probability of UFOs, particularly UFOs, is very small, because I don't think there is a large probability that there are sentient life forms within an appropriate distance of Earth. But we can talk about this after if you want the details.
Okay, so next question. I think this person here has been waiting.
Basically, if you contend that there is both an omnipotent and all-powerful God and that morality stems from him, aren't you left with the same paradox that Euthyphro was, whereby you state that either God created all that was goodness, or that, and in doing so, that he arbitrarily chose what was goodness because he created both good and evil, or else that he is intrinsically good, in which case goodness existed before him.
Yeah, are you appealing to the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Is it? Yeah, and the Euthyphro dilemma is something good because God wills it, or therefore the will would be almost arbitrary, or does God will something because it's good, and therefore the good would be sort of independent of God, and God would be subservient to the good? I actually think this is a false dilemma, because I think there's a third alternative, and I think, which is what you implied, which is God wills something because he is the good. God's moral commandments are a reflection and manifestation of his character, and God's essential character is holy, just, virtuous, loving, compassionate. So God's commandments are a reflection of God's character, which is why God couldn't, for example, when someone says, "Oh, what if God commanded us to rape people?" Well, God couldn't, because that would be in violation of his nature. Yeah, that's how I would answer that. I think there is a third alternative, which is that God's commandments are a reflection of his nature and character. Yeah.
Do you have anything
as far as our side is concerned, it's mostly irrelevant. The distinction between the two options that you gave or this third option that they're proposing, because to us, we don't accept yet the existence of objective morality anyway, or the existence of God. So these things would have to be shown to us with sufficient evidence to start with. So it doesn't really matter for us.
Okay, closing statements now, and it's Zach up for the first closing statement. 10 minutes.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for sticking around. Is this actually going? Sure. Right. So I'm just going to go through, kind of look at some of the points which the team from RSS have contributed this evening. There's a lot of them, so I'll just kind of skim through them. But I think the underlying thought that's going on is that belief in God is highly improbable. It's highly extraordinary, and therefore we need a heap of evidence before we're going to believe that. The underlying idea is we should start with naturalism, and anything on top of that is requires a heap of evidence. Now, I guess I just want to point you back to my burden of proof speech. I can't go through the whole thing, but I don't think we should start with naturalism. I don't think that's a rational place to start. Reason Science Society is all about starting with, discussing things in a rational and scientific and logical way, and I think that's entirely appropriate this evening. I just disagree with them on what is actually the rational starting point. I think they've kind of swayed back and forth on this point, but I'll come to that soon in my speech. So Josh started, one of his early points was the idea that giving up the belief in God might come at a cost for you. This is true, but this doesn't show that belief in God is false. Giving up your belief in rationalism may come at a social cost. If you're a member of the Reason Science Society exec, and you decide that maybe actually God does exist, I don't think you're going to be, you might face some social flack for that. I'm pretty sure you would. But that doesn't show that belief in God, that belief in rationalism is false, or it's just not relevant. It's the genetic. Yeah, I think it's the genetic fallacy. Josh flicked up a list very quickly. Flicked through a list of 6 things that he says we wouldn't expect if God did exist, but we do actually see in the world. I had to go back to his slides to see what those were, but so they were firstly, the universe is large and old. Secondly, the universe is rational. Thirdly, there isn't this idea that good people are morally rewarded in this life. Fourthly, there's the fact that tragedies occur. Fifthly, there's the existence of religious confusion, or what I'd call pluralism. And sixthly, there's the idea of the fact that reasonable non-belief exists in the world. Now, I think most of these aren't any evidence against the existence of God. First, the idea that the universe is large and old. There's no evidence against the existence of God. There's no reason to expect that it would be otherwise if God exists. I'll come back to this point a bit later. The universe is rational. And this is actually something I'd say is evidence for the existence of God, in that it's something we would expect if the universe were the creation of a rational mind. It's not something we'd expect if it's the creation of purposeless chaos, which is, I think, what the atheistic team would have to hold to. And that you can't have a purpose without any mind in the beginning. Thirdly, the idea that good people don't do better in life. Well, I don't think we'd expect on the Christian worldview that good people would do better. In fact, Christians are told that they should expect suffering. So this is simply a misstatement of the theistic or Christian hypothesis. Tragedies occur in the existence of reasonable non-belief. I think both instances of the problem of evil, which I agree is a problem for theism, but I don't think it's an overwhelming problem. The existence of pluralism isn't, I think, any evidence against the truth of Christianity. In fact, I think it's what we'd expect if Christianity is true, but you can come and ask me about that. Josh talked a bit about T-Rexes, using that as an example, which was cool. T-Rexes are great, but not entirely relevant. As I pointed out in my burden of proof speech, we're talking about something that isn't an entity in the world. So some of the standards that apply to entities in the world with regards to evidence, I think, don't apply when you're talking about the immaterial creator of the universe. Again, there's an underlying theme that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I want to ask, what is an extraordinary claim? Why is it that Christian theism is just assumed to be extraordinary? Maybe from your subjective standpoint it seems implausible, but this is very different to say that an objective probability assigned to Christian theism should be low. So I just dispute that claim that Christianity is an extraordinary claim, or at least that it is highly improbable.
So the question to ask is, what is the background situation, and what is the appropriate starting point? And I say maybe it's agnosticism, but it's not naturalism. So, and if you were, you kind of started off in your speech, in Josh's speech, saying that we're actually agnostics, well, then you can't go on to assume naturalism, as I think you actually did in the later speeches concerning miracles. You can't rule out miracles as a result of being highly improbable unless you've assumed naturalism. If you've assumed naturalism, that's very different to the proper starting point, which is agnosticism. Another theme that came up a few times is the idea that God, on the Christian worldview, made the universe just so he can have a personal relationship with us. Maybe this is what some Christians say, but this is not true. This is not the proper Christian claim. This is a misrepresentation of Christian theism. God made the universe for his own glory. That's the central point. There's a subset of that where he does want to have a personal relationship with people. He does seek for people, and he does care about people. But it doesn't follow that because God has a certain purpose, that this is the purpose for which he created the universe. So this is just a misrepresentation, which I think undergirds a lot of their claims this evening. Another suggestion is 40,000 competing Christian conceptions of God. I think this is from the idea that there are 40,000 denominations, perhaps. But if you actually look at the origins of these denominations, a lot of them are for geographic or social reasons, and actually aren't concerned with the competing conceptions of God. So a lot of these denominations will actually agree in entirety in their conception of God, and more substantially, most of them will agree in the main substance. So it's just a false claim. We also had the interesting claim that human sacrifice is a universal practice, and therefore for the same, we shouldn't accept human sacrifice, and so just because God is kind of a universal belief, we shouldn't believe that. I mean, obviously human sacrifice isn't a universal practice. If it was universally practiced, we wouldn't be here. Yeah, so it seems a bizarre claim. Okay, so that was the burden of proof. What about cosmology? I think the position advocated by Blake, suggesting that we shouldn't trust that the universe is going to be rational or comprehensible, I think that actually cuts against scientific realism, which is something else that they want to hold to. So the idea that we should take science seriously, I think actually requires some faith that the universe is going to be rational and comprehensible. And you can't kind of have that one minute and then disregard that the next. So I think there is a bit of a problem there. Another point, he argued against what's called the Kalam cosmological argument, the idea that because the universe had a beginning, therefore God exists. But this wasn't what we offered this evening. We offered the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which is from the principle of sufficient reason that everything that exists has a cause or an explanation. So this was a different argument. Interesting, he suggested the idea that radioactive decay is uncaused, and therefore there are some things in the world that are uncaused, and therefore we can't infer that just because something exists that it has a cause. I mean, I disagree with that. I don't think that radioactive decay should necessarily be thought of as uncaused. I just say that it is caused but probabilistically caused. It's caused by the laws of physics, which on an indeterministic interpretation, which may not be the correct one, are probabilistic, but they're still a cause. I mean, look, there's lots of stuff here, but I think he misrepresents the fine-tuning argument, which is interesting, but we didn't present the fine-tuning argument, so we can leave that for another evening. Moving on to morality, skipping through. So Alex, I think, actually kind of agreed with us that, and that if there were a God, there would be objective morality. If there is no God, then there is no objective morality. So, the atheist team seems to believe the idea that there is no objective morality. And they argue that morality is merely subjective. And one of the reasons for thinking that is that because morality is made by human persons, and human persons have feelings about certain things, have moral feelings, and therefore we should conclude that morality is subjective. But this simply doesn't follow. Individual human people make scientific claims and have scientific beliefs, but this doesn't mean that science is subjective. Just pointing to the way in which moral beliefs are formed is not relevant to whether objective morality is true. There was the quoting of a verse in Leviticus, but this was simply a misrepresentation of how Christians would understand that verse, in that Leviticus wasn't written to us today. So that verse was cannot be applied directly to you in the audience. Why should we believe in objective morality, though? I think it's an inference to the best explanation. I think it is the best explanation of the facts we have concerning moral beliefs. So it's not that we have no reason for thinking it at all. So they deny objective morality, but then on the other hand, they go on to accept humanism. I think humanism is a meaningless construct if there is no such thing as objective morality. You can't judge, you can't critique anyone on the basis of humanism if morality is not objective. You can't believe in moral progress. Okay, finally on to revelation. In general, we were offered what's called the skeptical litmus test. The problem with this test, or one problem, is that it rules out historical evidences, which are the only kind of evidences which we would reasonably expect for historical claims concerning revelation. So it simply begs the question. Kieran suggests that we should pick the simplest claim. This is interesting because a lot of Christian philosophers believe that the Christian hypothesis is the simplest claim. So I'll just sum up. On one hand, we've got the Reason Science Society, on the other hand, we've got the Evangelical Union. And maybe you might think, oh, it's kind of reason versus faith. I think this is absurd. I think there's good reason to believe that the Christian faith is true, and therefore, it's quite possible to belong to both clubs, as I do, and to engage in this dialogue rationally. And thank you for your time.
Okay, closing statements. I'd like to thank the other team for being such good sports about everything, and especially the pizza that we're about to get, so I'll try to get through this pretty quickly. I'd like to make a couple of clarifications. I was not implying for a second that because there's a cost, that means it's wrong. No, I was explaining why you believe that's such a thing and why people tend not to critically analyse some of their beliefs. And again, for the umpteenth time, we're not defending naturalism. And I stated very quite clearly when I listed those 6 things that these are things that are consistent with there being no supernatural force. But that doesn't mean that a supernatural force doesn't exist. He could have created a universe like this, and I think that was a complete straw manning of the position that I put forward there. Right. Now, we are all in the kind of... but to take a leaf out of Zach's book... To take a leaf out of Zach's book, we're in the position of doubting Thomas. Now, according to that parable, Thomas was one of Jesus' followers. He followed him around, he saw him do all these amazing things, but when he resurrected, Thomas didn't believe. And even when his friends told him that this had happened, Thomas still didn't believe. It wasn't until he got to poke his fingers in Jesus' wounds that he believed. And the story from the parable, the message I think it's trying to teach is skepticism is a good thing, because otherwise you'll believe false beliefs. And Jesus was okay with Thomas not believing in him until he had the chance, and I think he'd be the same thing with you. And now, I agree that tonight was pretty quick. So we've got actually a YouTube channel called the Auckland RSS. You can go back and look at everything that's been said tonight. This talk will be up there. There's also a playlist of taking care of the morality and everything in more detail there from around the internet. It's a great place for you to start. Now, we talked about the burden of proof, cosmology, holy books, that sort of thing. Now, I can't think I can make it any more clear than I already have, that if you're making a claim, the burden of proof is on you. If I reject that claim because I don't think you met your burden of proof, I shouldn't have to prove a negative. That was the point behind all of that. Yes, the Kalam's often used, and it was used in the last debate, and the thing with negative evidence and the T-Rexes is why I brought it up, because that was thrown at me last time. Now, but we'll skip through that. I will wholly agree with you, though, that when you look at some of these theories that physicists come up with, they probably are smoking something. It seems like that to me. It's completely crazy. It's counterintuitive, but unfortunately, when they go do the tests, the observations back this up, and the math is consistent. So I'm going to have to give it that they're probably onto something. But yeah, it is kind of wacky. You can have complexity without a divine influence. The game of life is a really good example of that. Basically, it's a computer program that iterates over and over again, and with just 4 very simple properties of styles and some starting conditions, you can get a chaotic system, a stable position, a repeating pattern. You get emergence complexity, which is why it's quite easy for space and time just to be all that there needs to be, and we're in a fluctuation at the moment. When we talk about design in the universe and that sort of thing, what about all the examples of intelligent design? We have things like the eye, it's completely retarded. There's a thing at the back of it, it doesn't work. But the octopus eye is great. We have other things to make us think that no, things aren't designed with some sort of plan in mind. Like the bunny rabbit, for example. They're cute, they're fluffy, they've got a bit in the back that actually was where they ferment their grass. They then poop it out and have to eat it Now, who designed that? But we won't go into that because unfortunately that wasn't looked at too much. On to morality. Now, yes, there's that false dilemma, supposedly false dilemma, about whether something's good or moral because God declares it to be so, or because he declares it to be so because it's good and moral. If it is, then any act, including the immoral things that God commands, is therefore moral, which is clearly wrong. If he says so because it's good and moral, well then it has their properties independent. And then going and saying, well, it's because God, that's part of his nature and he allows you to see it, decides to set this issue, goes outside, is kind of incorrect. Like, what about jealousy? He says he's a jealous God. Should we take jealousy to suggest that God exists? No, I don't think you can use morality. They've only ever asserted that objective morality exists. They haven't actually proven it. Morality is a very interesting subject, though. I'd strongly suggest everyone takes a look at, on the TED site, Franz Weil. He's gone through and looked at how you can get morality in a natural system, and you find it across species and across cultures, and it has to do with empathy and compassion and fairness. And subjective morality is anything but random and meaningless. Right? These things, surely, if with God's divine command, anything is also permissible. We have the same social rules popping up, not because we have a thing to God, but also actually because of empathy with our own fellow species. If you don't have that, you won't survive. But maybe there is from a bottom-up objective morality. That could be possible. There's this idea of the social contract that you're a rational individual, you know about existence and how things interact, but you don't know who you are. What sort of rules would you apply to? Would you be willing to say it's okay for you to rape? If you don't know if you're the raper or the rapee, clearly you'd say no. And that's why we have this visceral feeling that there is objective morality, when really there probably isn't. But that doesn't mean it's arbitrary or meaningless. As for the morality from Christianity, there's a huge loophole in it. Believe in me and I'll forgive your sins. That's what the message from Jesus is. However, if I go and I'm visiting my girlfriend in America and I see Miranda, and I see someone trying to abduct a small child and I try to intervene and I die in the process, but the cops get to him, they find out that he's a serial child molester, he gets the death chair. I go to hell for all eternity. He says, so I'm sorry, Jesus, he gets to go to heaven. What is the accountability there? Where is the morals there? I do not think that it exists. To ignore that is not to be true. And meaning can be subjective. It doesn't have to be objective in terms of a God to have it. Now, as for miracles, when you look around the world, you see miracles everywhere. It doesn't matter what you're looking at, which area you're coming from. Now, Zach tried to put this away as being the genetic fallacy. I don't think that's quite true. Now, basically, I've got too many notes here. I'm going to skip it over. When we're looking at the faiths from around the world, it is actually inconceivable that they're all correct. Some of them have to be wrong because they're mutually exclusive. If you're going to take a position, the most reasonable one to start with is that they're all wrong, and for one to step out from the herd to prove that it's right, it's going to have to require some pretty convincing evidence that can't be applied to other explanations, and we haven't had that yet. No. Now, we have people truly believing in things like the Heaven Gates thing, where they're willing to sacrifice themselves, and even Scientologists. They actually do come at a cost. They die from refusing medical intervention because of what their beliefs say. They suffer social stigmatism. They get abuse as well, because we all think that it's a cult and we're probably all right. So there is a significant cost to them believing what they believe. Does that mean that their belief is actually true? No. Does it mean it's false? No. It just means that if you have a weird belief, sometimes you are actually persecuted for it. And as for seeing things like Revelation, there's this thing where you can actually listen to a song backwards and you'll hear words. If you see the words up on the screen, you're more likely to hear it. There's an awesome video of it on the internet. I'll be putting it up on the RSS website as well. But to finish on an up note, from Christopher Hitchens as well, take a risk of thinking for yourself. I would strongly recommend everyone reads the Bible, but don't get in your little prayer groups and do it. Do it yourself at home. Don't read it from the beginning to end. Read the comparison chapters of Matthew, Luke, and John and see how they contradict each other. Right? Start at the beginning of the Old Testament. But when you're looking at things chronologically, you've got to compare what they're saying at the same time to see those contradictions. Make the decision. Do you think that an omnipotent God would be so obtuse to make it so confusing and hard for you to believe? I truly used to believe when I was a kid, and I can't. I'm not built that way anymore. I think I'm a decent guy. I'm going to hell apparently, if hell exists, and so are a lot of other people. You can't actually force yourself to believe, and this is the problem. Even if it was logically true that you could not deny God, well, now you've got rid of free will. And if you believe that the sins of the father visited on the child is a fair thing, well, then I think I'm going to have to disagree with your morality, even if it is subjective. But anyway, that doesn't mean we can't get along, and I'd like to thank my opponents who are all sniggering about my closing, and invite all of you to come on to the RSS. We don't often talk about religion because, quite frankly, we get bored with it. And hopefully we'll be having a few more talks on science and philosophy fairly soon. Thank you.